Well, welcome everybody. I believe we are live, and thank you all for sticking with us. I know, at least on the East Coast here, we are getting into the very late afternoon. So appreciate you all being here with us. My name is Mike McGee. I'm the CEO of Chiefs for Change. We are a community of about 36 prominent K-12 systems leaders from around the country, all working around a common set of beliefs about what needs to change in public education in order for every student to be put on a pathway to success. And we're lucky to have three of our members here today. Janice Jackson, the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, Louis Furby, the Chancellor of Washington, D.C. Public Schools, Penny Schwinn, the Commissioner of Education in Tennessee, along with Mike Fee from Spotlight Education, who is a real expert around the topic we're going to be discussing today, which is how to effectively use post-secondary outcomes data as part of an overall effort to create better post-secondary pathways for all of our kids. We've all rightly been focused during the pandemic on how to make K-12 schooling work for students in the midst of the pandemic. But today we're going to focus on a particular group of students, those who have recently graduated from our K-12 systems or will graduate soon. 40% of them are telling us that they may not enroll in college due to the complexities of the pandemic for themselves and their families. And the workforce that they're entering is one where their prospects are deeply uncertain. We're going to talk today about what school systems can do to help them, and how can data play a role in designing those supports and standing them up on behalf of students. It is an area of our work in K-12 education that our panelists have thought deeply about, so I'm very excited to get a chance to talk to them about this topic today. Welcome to all of you as panelists. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to start, Louis and Janice, with you as superintendents of large school systems. Can you talk a little bit about your concerns for this year's graduates, the ones who just recently graduated from your systems, and next year's graduates who are participating in a very, very complex school environment right now and looking towards college acceptances, job applications, and would be curious to hear you talk about what efforts look like in Chicago and DC around bridging the divide between K-12 and higher education and the workforce, and how you're using data to inform that work.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike. I'll start. Before I jump into some of the specifics of what we're actually doing, I do want to share that when the pandemic first hit, one of my first, Zoom engagements with students consisted of me speaking with a panel of students that were recent graduates of Chicago Public Schools who were, freshmen and trying to navigate what the rest of their school year was going to look like. And in listening to them, we heard, all sorts of tales about just the uncertainty of what the remainder of the year would look like. The fact that it wasn't just about needing to come home from school, but the compounded issues around having family members that are essential workers, family members that may themselves have contracted COVID. And this was very early on in the disease. And so it was eye-opening. But one thing that was encouraging when I heard that is the safety net that CPS had built for our students. The fact that they even thought that there was, a place to go to talk to people in the school system after they have graduated really speaks to a decade of work that the district has been engaged in to support our students. It started with data and accountability, as you pointed out. If you look at our school accountability system here in Chicago, we were one of the first districts to not only look at outcomes in the K through 12 space, but we actually rate high schools based on college matriculation and persistence data. And so that work that had been ongoing for a while really helped us to create this culture of supporting students beyond 12th grade. We also, have a summer melt program, which I know many districts do, but those relationships and that connective fiber between a counselor and someone who supported students during that summertime really came in handy when we were trying to support our students who were trying to navigate what their post-secondary prospects would look like under COVID. So I say all that to say, I still remain encouraged. We have a lot of students who aspire to go to college. What we know is that fewer of them will attend, and that's under normal circumstances. And we should expect that number is going to decrease with given COVID if we don't put a strong system of wraparound services in place to support them. And data and technology can help us do that.
Thank you, Janice. Louis, what does this area of work look like in DC?
Yeah, so for Mike, for us, we were very fortunate that we were planning the launch of what we call DC Persist, which is our alumni support model prior to COVID. And we were very fortunate that we were able to launch this initiative for the class of 2020. And this allows us to do a number of things that we believe are beneficial to students, especially during this time of COVID. It provides us the opportunity to give all of our graduates going to post-secondary institutions coaching supports. And so they have a coach that is assigned to them that will target special needs that they may have, especially during that freshman and sophomore year. And then it'll be more supplemental and light touches thereafter in their junior and senior year. But we've also provided the graduates the opportunity to have access to mini grants through this initiative. So if a student has a special need with housing or they need support with technology, they can apply for dollars that we would distribute to students. And what we found is students were experiencing challenges. They had grants or scholarships, and the process for executing those was a little bit different this year. And for a lot of students, their housing scenarios were very different, whether or not they were actually going to a campus or remaining at home or going to a campus and taking courses virtually. And so we wanted to ensure that students had access to very robust supports, given that their anticipated higher ed experience will look different. And then we've established as the part of this initiative our Forever DCPS alumni database. This is our first attempt to ensure that we have contact information. We're able to collect information on all of our graduates' performance in their higher ed institutions, and then we're also able to track their persistence. We believe that this is critical to our coaching, but also a way to ensure that we know where all of our students are. And we have a goal to dramatically increase our college persistence. And then finally, as a part of this, we have what we call Smart Choice Colleges that we partner with local and regional universities where many of our students go to create a network on that campus so students can connect with each other that are graduates of DCPS, and there's intentional supports between DCPS and the university.
Thank you, Louis. Mike, there's everything that a district can use in terms of data to inform their decisions about how to support students, but there's also opportunities for parents and students to use data themselves to make good choices. How is Spotlight empowering students and families to make their college and career readiness choices? How are you thinking about making data more accessible to families so that they can use it to inform their pathways to success?
Sure, Mike. First, I'm going to take my cues from last night's debate and answer the question that I was hoping you to ask instead, and then I'll come to your question. Just by way of speaking to my background, evidently my Mac isn't quite up to our virtual background, but it gives me the opportunity to sit in front of this poster, which is of the Little Rock 9 being exported into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is the state where I started my career. It's a reminder and an inspiration as we take on this work humbly. I guess that's the first part of my answer, now answering your question, which is in working with these students and their families in particular, knowing that these families come from a wide range of backgrounds, we approach it with humility. And I realize that's not the technologically oriented answer you were expecting to hear, But if we're going to use technology to not only give information to students and families, but to train that information in a targeted and personalized way, and even offer suggestions as to how best to aspire higher, we have to approach this with humility. We do it in their language. We use language that they are almost certain to understand. And most importantly, we personalize the information rather than just tell a student and their family, hey, here's all the information you could ever want to have about what you might be headed toward after high school. We train that information in this very personalized and targeted way so that they are virtually certain to access it, to understand it, and then to act on it.
Thank you, Mike. Penny, Tennessee's been a leader in college affordability in much of the pathways work that we're all aspiring to do. And you've also worked to align data from multiple state agencies as a state chief to inform support for graduates. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the Tennessee Promise and Tennessee Pathways work, where that stands currently, how data informs that work, and what your hopes are for the future of that work?
Sure, and I think you said it best when you said, Tennessee's had a long history of this, and part of what we know leads to success is continuity in terms of vision and drive and leadership, and we've been very fortunate in this state to have that for over a decade. So, at this point, over the past 5 years, Tennessee's increased participation in our CTE programs and increased the seamless transition into our college programs, so that right now we do not have a difference between our CTE students. They're enrolling in college at the same rates as our non-CTE students. And that's something that I think is a really big marker of success in terms of the quality of the programs that are offered. We've also seen that with a consistent rise in CTE enrollment. We were at about 30% in 2011 when a lot of this work started, and we're about 50% just over today. But I think some of the things that have been most important are numbers. So one would be in our Tennessee Pathways certification. That's a process where we work very closely with our higher education partners and our industry partners to set rigorous goals around what the alignment needs to look like between the labor market, kind of academic student advising, and then the quality of those early experiences in high school that will get students on a pathway to their post-secondary attainment goals. And in that first year, in the 2018-19 school year, we had 82 districts submit 400 applications for different programs. Now, we approved just over 120 of those at about 75 high schools, but that, I think, laid the foundation for work that is happening and continuing to happen relating to this year. We've had several hundred, 354 applications for new programs that we can start. But most importantly is this summer, we're trying to take a lot of this information that's coming in around how our local regions are able to align what the interests are of students, what the job opportunities are, and then what that higher education opportunity or pathway needs to be. We're taking that information and launched the Certified Pathways Dashboard, and that essentially allows us to map for internal and external stakeholders all of the hundreds of different partnerships that exist across the state. And that does a couple of things. One, it allows our K-12 programs to be able to understand where the opportunities are regionally for their graduates and who they need to partner with. I think second one it does is for industry coming into Tennessee and those who are either starting businesses or expanding their businesses, they know exactly where some of these really critical programs are, and it allows us to better partner our high school graduates into programs that get them employed after high school. But all of that means that you have to have partnership, like I said, between higher ed and certainly between workforce. And Tennessee Promise is a great example of that. It pays for the first 2 years of that community college for students so that they are reducing debt and able to matriculate into programs, which is fantastic. And we're continuing to see an increase in that work.
Thank you, Penny. I'm curious now to hear from all of you. If our systems were perfect, we wouldn't be on this panel right now. So what's still needed in terms of data, dashboards for school leaders, for systems leaders, for parents and students? If you could snap your fingers, what would you have today that you don't have? And reflect, if you can, on what challenges we're still facing in order to get the data that we need and get it to the right people in the right places. And anyone can feel free to jump in on that.
Yeah,
Any,
well, what jumps out at me right away is the National Clearinghouse database. It's a phenomenal resource that we rely on in order to determine that metric that I mentioned earlier around college matriculation and persistence. There are a few issues with it. It could be more comprehensive. There are some schools that aren't included. I know for a while HBCUs weren't included. So you had students going to phenomenal universities that were not being adequately counted as pursuing post-secondary pathways because they were not a part of that. I think that has been updated. I'm not 100% sure, but we internally found a way to better capture that. We also don't look at other pathways outside of a traditional four-year college in that database. So I think looking to see if students have enrolled in, an approved trades program, a gap year, the military service, for example, our service academies don't count. These are some of the most prestigious schools in the country. And if a student is attending a service academy, it doesn't count in that clearinghouse. And I think that's probably the most robust and comprehensive set of data around what students are doing after high school. And I would just like to see that expanded to include other pathways outside of four-year universities at traditional colleges.
thank you, Janice.
I agree with everything that Janice said, and I think it's incredibly important as we look at the effectiveness of our work and how we continue to grow in that. I would say kind of 3 points on our end at the state level is one is how are we getting students into pathways that match what their interests will be? High school is oftentimes too late. They get into the pathways and then they realize that's not really what they like. And now we've invested a lot of time, and so have they, on things that might not pay off later. And so how do we get some of those early career exploration opportunities in the middle school? I'm excited that Perkins 5 allows us to do that a little bit more effectively, but then also into elementary. I think in real time, we also need data tracking that allows us to follow students who have maybe been in these pathways. What do they do when they're in their higher education pathways? Sometimes we can track them to see if they continue on in that same content area or field, and sometimes we can't. And then what does that mean for job opportunities? But separately, I think that one of the things we really have to think about is how are we being very intentional about what those long-term job opportunities are in regions, especially for our rural students, and then making sure that we're proactively building out CTE pathways to match the new industries coming in. They have to work in tandem with one another. Otherwise, we are not actually providing the employee supply pool that many of our industries are looking for. And I think that data has to be much more cohesive and in a usable way so that school districts actually can see it and they can do something with it. And it doesn't require the amount of manipulation and time and capacity that it currently takes to be able to make it usable and workable for schools.
And Mike, I'm going to manage my airtime, but I have to jump on this one because Penny talked about careers. And I think in a perfect world, we would have much more data about students who go straight to work. I know that there are limitations here in Illinois to access that data. And we need some reforms at the top. That data is housed at the Department of Labor, and what that looks like at the state level and then at the city level. The data just isn't as clean as and it isn't as dynamic as it needs to be for us to make decisions around it. So that's another place where I would like to see a stronger data system.
Janice, I talk to many leaders all across the country about this, and I can say for our audience that to a breathtaking degree, most school districts do not know where their kids go if they go from high school into the workforce. And I don't think the public is quite aware of the fact that those students who need our support as much as any other student go off the grid in many of our school districts. And there are solutions to that we all should be working on.
Absolutely.
I'll subject a hopeful note, Mike, which is in our work, we have the opportunity to witness the really broad-based progress that's being made in districts like Chicago and DC. I mean, the Learn, Plan, Succeed program in Chicago, DC Persist in Washington, DC. These are holistic approaches, and they're starting to gather the kinds of data that are going to allow us to tell every student one by one, here's what's possible for you. We know where students like you can end up if you take the following steps, because we have tracked this, holistically and longitudinally. It's starting to happen. It's certainly much more, we've made a lot more progress in the college space than the workforce space, as Penny and Janice just described. But it is exciting to see the progress that is happening in some of our nation's biggest, most diverse districts.
Louis, if you could snap your fingers, what would you add to the DC program right now?
I think Janice and Penny, I've already said a mouthful. I mean, I would double click on the data for those students that go directly to the workforce, and especially those students that go to the military. I think that's another group that we often don't think about, and it's great to know where our students are who decided to serve our country, and the point Penny made about understanding the labor market is huge, because we've already asked in our region to convene our industry leaders, because the post-COVID labor market is going to look very different. And I think about places where tourism and hospitality is a huge part of the economy, like it is here in the DC region, and what that means for the future, and how it will shift potentially, and what are the needs around healthcare, and there's just so much I think that will look different in the years ahead, and we don't want to get caught flat-footed in the way that we're preparing our students for not only higher ed, but to go to work and earn a livable wage for themselves and their family. And the final thing that I think we have to talk about is socioeconomic mobility. We got to keep track of the data to ensure that we know that the students who are born in the poverty are actually taking a step up. And if we do all this work really well, we continue to get the same outcomes as relates to socioeconomic mobility, I think we failed. And so I think that's another data point that we should be monitoring and tracking.
I think it's a great point, Louis. As you know, the federal government and state governments have, for a very long time, had an important civil rights monitoring function that's been largely focused on math and reading proficiency results. But if the federal government and state governments were able to really understand where students go after they graduate from high school, you can imagine that really filling out the picture on whether we are supporting students in an equitable way and fulfilling the civil rights function of education. So certainly something to hope for in the future. Well, we have a question from our audience, which I think is a great question, which is, this person says, we don't have enough counselors in schools to provide the kind of guidance to students, even if we have the data. Do you all have thoughts on how you could align good information about post-secondary pathways to the kind of counseling and guidance that would really help students to make good informed choices?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can always use more employees in the school system, counselors, nurses. I always tell people if there was a magic button, no one would beat me to it to fill up these positions. But the fact of the matter is, many of us operate in resource constraint environments. Now, luckily here in Chicago, counselors are what we call foundational positions. So every school has at least one. And then based on the number of students, they more are added. With that said, we have increasingly seen the number of duties and tasks kind of pile up for our counselors. So as a superintendent, one of my first moves was to remove some of those things, like the requirement to be in charge of testing and some of these other things that took up an inordinate amount of their time, but really wasn't the work that they went to school to do. On a positive note, our counselors want to do the guidance counseling work. So when Learn, Plan, Succeed was introduced as a requirement, many of them were already doing this work, but they were kind of cobbling together information about their students, hundreds of students. And so what the district has been able to do is to purchase technology and software so that there are technological solutions that reduce our reliance on people. That is a fact. And we've been able to do that through the use of Naviance, which is another one of those programs that allows for three-way communication. And we start that in middle school, to the point Penny raised earlier, so we can start having these conversations more organically with our students and families. So we've been able to do that. And then the Spotlight report that we use we call it the Learn, Plan, Succeed report here, but it's essentially Mike's work with Spotlight that I learned about at a conference. And it allows for us every semester to have a specific and targeted conversation with students. I remember being a principal and I directed my counselors to have a conversation with every student. And the counselors would have to take weeks to amass all of this information. Now it's at their fingertips. It's updated regularly based on student interest data, courses that they've completed. This year, we added more information because we want to encourage our students that are diverse learners or students with disabilities to start looking at options that are going to support them so that they can go to college and they know that college is for them. And so I think that there is a balancing act in a resource constrained environment. Technology and data, that's your friend, and that's going to help you keep this work moving. And because we had strong data and technological systems in place, we were able to stay in contact with the class of 2020 and see them off to college. Now, the thing that we're tracking now is whether or not they're able to stay and successfully complete this first year.
That's really exciting. Thanks, Janice.
I can build on what Janice was saying a little bit around, I think, the importance of that continuity. So there's two things that I think that we have to focus on, and then how data plays into that. So one is when we're thinking about our GEAR money and our CARES money and ESSER money coming in for the COVID response, one of the things Tennessee is prioritizing those allocations is around academic advising and support. And we are incredibly lucky to have folks like the AIRS Foundation and the Nice-Wanger Foundation here who have found ways to ensure that they can work with students and their students not just matriculate into, but persist through their post-secondary pathways. Some incredible data in some of our areas that need the most support. So we're expanding those programs because we know it's so important and because we know that the work of our schools, if this pandemic has shown us nothing, it is that our schools do more than we even knew. And so we want to make sure that we can bring in external partners to support that. Now, that all is great if we can get those resources and these amazing partners in Tennessee who can support our schools and students from middle school through the first 2 years after high school. They still have to have the opportunities in place in their schools to take advantage of. And what we've seen is that our rural communities, our small high schools, some of our I think, most under-resourced schools, those students don't have the same work-based learning opportunities, AP opportunities, et cetera. So we also have to find innovative ways using technology and data to get them access. So we'll be piloting things like AP classes online that students can take regardless of where they sit now that they're getting Wi-Fi and they have a device. So if we can give them the opportunities and we can use data to identify the best fits for students and match them with apprenticeships or internships, match them with online courses, and then pair that with a counselor who has a data system that allows them to say, great, let's actually walk through the pathway of your choice. Let's actually map that out. And how can I get predictive data to be able to say, great, here are some things that are going to be the best opportunities for you to take advantage of to meet the goal you've set for yourself. But all three have to be in place: that support for the student, the actual opportunities themselves, and then I think the data that facilitates that process in an efficient way given the caseloads that folks are working with. And I think there's a lot of opportunity right now in this moment to take advantage of that because there's interest, there's the ability for investment, and a lot of folks who are being very, very creative and innovative. So I hope we are able to harness that in an effective way.
Yeah, leveraging technology as a force multiplier for our counselors is crucial. You know, I read about school systems, maybe it's a state, maybe it's a district, and they find some funding and they're able to hire a lot of new counselors, and these are admirable efforts, and it's great, and they get their student to counselor ratio from, you know, maybe it's 600 to 400. Again, totally admirable, and that's there's surely a benefit to those students and to the counselors. In this improved state, you've got 400 students for every counselor, and in most cases, it's not like in Chicago. They are still getting duties as requested, taking on the standardized testing, working with a whole range of students, not only students who are headed to college or careers, but students facing all kinds of issues. We can and we do leverage technology not only as a personalized information source for students and families, but as a tool to make counselors more effective, but frankly, just more efficient. I mean, it sounds like Silicon Valley speak, but in this case, efficiency is crucial when you're talking about an absolutely overloaded workforce like these counselors.
I would add one other thing that we've been working on at Chiefs for Change in terms of how schools are being redesigned in response to the pandemic. We speak about counselors at the school level, but there's also a potential role for mentors to play at a much more granular level with students. One of the things that we recommended in our report, The Return, way back in the early stages of the pandemic, was that there's an opportunity to redesign schools so that you actually do have a mentor for every 10 or 12 students which might help with health and safety, and certainly will help with guiding students down the right path. I think about what the possibilities would be if mentors in a school on that type of model actually had access to the kind of data we're talking about today and could use it effectively.
Yeah, Mike, I think the point you make about data is one I just want to lift up. Having actionable data step by step as early as the middle grades, as Janice highlighted, is so important. Too often students get too far down the path in high school and it's too many I didn't know or I didn't have that information. And so I think school districts have a responsibility to ensure that step by step, a family knows what all the graduation requirements are. They know how to access a student transcript, what to look for. They know what the smart choice colleges are. And I think it's one thing to counsel, but it's another thing to ensure that there's enough information to make informed decisions and to guide families through how you do that.
Thank you, Louis. One other reflection I would have is that, when it works really well, as Penny knows, state policy as well as federal policy makes the work of schools easier, not harder. And this area of data is a perfect example of that, I think. And there's much work still to do. But for our audience, it's worth knowing, particularly if you're an advocate, that this area of post-secondary outcomes data, things like college persistence, degree and credential completion, employment, earnings, is not just under the purview of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Much of that lives in the Higher Education Act. And Congress, of course, authorizes and reauthorizes both of those laws every once in a while. So as you hear about these things on the federal level, there's much that could be done in terms of federal laws and regulations around data in both of those very, very important education laws that we should all be thinking about working on together. One other question from the audience. When the outcomes data isn't encouraging, for example, the limited number of women and people of color in STEM, how do you ensure that students receive guidance that drives equitable outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's the best case, most compelling case for the use of data. I think when we didn't have access to this type of data, everybody was still working hard, but there was this false sense that we were being successful because the students who the ones that I like to say we're going to be okay no matter what are there. We're helping them, we're working with them, we're getting them through college. But when you start looking at data, it allows you to identify students that have been missed. And anyone who's worked in a large school system knows that this happens far too often. So I think that I think the point you raised earlier about the data systems is something that I wanted to go back to, because I think another solution that has been helpful here in Chicago is our partnership with the University of Chicago's Consortium on School Research. When I talk to superintendents about this, sometimes they look at me, with crazy eyes, because for over 2 decades, we have given unfettered access to our district's data to the University of Chicago, and been able to leverage their resources, their brain trust, so that they can answer some of those questions. So much of what we know about what happens with our students is because of that partnership in the program To and Through, which you can look up on their website. So I say all that to say, it takes a collection of people. There's a full ecosystem working on this, but now we're in a position where we know which students are on track, we know which students are in the middle, and we know which students need wraparound services and places where we have to double down our efforts. When people see our FAFSA completion rate, which we have been focused on for over 5 years now, they laugh. Are you pulling them out of the lunch line? We are. That's exactly what we're doing. Because we have this data, we don't have to keep making blanket announcements about, complete your FAFSA because it's important. Because of our robust data systems, we know who's doing it in the first couple of weeks, and we know who's waiting until the last day. And that allows us to take actionable steps. And we know that all of these things collectively help put our students on a firmer ground so that they can explore post-secondary opportunities.
Well, I'll just add, Janice, that FAFSA completion has been a big advocacy priority for Chiefs for Change. We created something called the FAFSA Fast Break, so that all of our members could participate and encourage their students to fill out their FAFSA. As I'm sure our audience knows, it's critical to college affordability for so many students. And we've had Arnie Duncan, Barack Obama's Secretary of Education, as well as Senator Lamar Alexander from Penny's great state of Tennessee, both involved with us on this. There's a lot of bipartisan consensus about simplifying the FAFSA, doing whatever we can to make sure everyone fills it out. So that's an important and exciting area of policy work as well.
The only thing I would add to that, Mike, and I think similar to what Janice said, is that we have all these opportunity gaps, and we talk about that, and it's incredibly important. But one of the things that we have to make sure works with data is we can say that there's a bunch of data. We can talk through all of the opportunities that we wish our students from low-income communities, our rural students, our students who maybe don't have as many opportunities in their high schools and middle schools. Those have to be bridged together so that it is practitioner-based and practitioner-focused. And I think so often we look at new systems that roll out, it is very much either just in a policy lens, or it requires too much translation between the data and the tech into the practitioner. So if we really want to think about how we are going to connect more opportunities to all students, how we're going to monitor and hold ourselves accountable so that all of our students have access to equitable opportunities, regardless of where they live, we have to make sure that the data is produced and presented in such a way that is usable for teachers in the classroom, for principals, for superintendents, for district folks, and for the community in the experience in which they will use it and through the lens in which they need to look at it. And I think that the one size fits all, very, very complicated way that sometimes we talk about and roll out data makes it hard for all of our end users to be able to really grasp onto it and figure out this is the way that it's going to work for the job that I have to do for kids. So that crosswalk and translation has got to be easier and easier. And I think that user-based experience and how we create new tools, how we roll them out, how we train people through the lens of the end user is going to need to be, I think, a real area of focus for us so that we can really harness the information we have in a productive way.
You're really speaking our language, Commissioner Schwinn. We have this belief at Spotlight, which is if data isn't personalized, it's probably just not going to get through to that student, to that teacher, perhaps the parent. Everybody expects their information to be personalized today. I get the news feed that I want. If we try to train a fire hose at students and say, here's all the information that you can need, they're just not going to consume it. And if they do, there's a pretty good chance they're not going to understand it. And it may even be discouraging. I think about the question from the audience, what if that data is discouraging? What if we are telling our an African-American girl who's going to graduate soon that, look, the data is showing that you don't have a great shot in a STEM field? Within that data, there is a story for that student that shows what she can aspire to and what she can become, but it has to be a personalized message specifically for her. And with technology, we are entirely capable of communicating in that fashion to our students and their families.
Can I ask, and we've just got a couple of more minutes, but I'm intrigued by this area of the conversation. You are prominent leaders in your states and cities. Does this kind of data potentially put you in a stronger position as advocates for your students? I'm thinking about STEM, for instance. would a really rich landscape of data here allow you to go to, say, your regional employers in the STEM space and say, actually, we do have young women and people of color who are ready to take jobs in your industry? Is that a possibility on the horizon if we use data as effectively as we could?
I absolutely think so. And I'm gonna defer to Lewis because I saw him want to jump in. And so for airtime's sake, I will say for states recruiting businesses in, we have to tell a story. The data has to tell a story, and that has to match the pool of graduates that we have. But I'm going to turn it over to the great chancellor just below me.
No, I just quickly would say,
The last word.
Yeah, that if we have to hold our communities accountable for cultivating local talent, and our employers have to be responsible for helping us do that. And I think when you have compelling data that you can put in front of your local employers, this helps advance the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Lewis. Well, thank you to all four of you. This was a great conversation. So appreciate you being here today. Thanks to our audience. For those who are interested, you can follow Chiefs for Change on Twitter @ChiefsForChange, and you'll hear a lot about the Chiefs who were on our panel today. Mike, thank you so much for being here and for the work you're doing. And our next panel is the Power of Women panel, starting in just a couple of minutes. So have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.